So with that in mind, what I wanted to do was just some fundamental discussion around combination product. Many people are very familiar with what that means, others may not be, so I just want to sort of level set everything. From a FDA perspective, right, a combination product is considered single entity, which is a pre-filled syringe system, that type of product. Co-packaged, where you would actually have, for instance, a drug in a vial. And then that would be co-packaged in a kit, for example, with a vial adapter. Or cross-labeled. So where with your drug product, you're stating this drug product should be used with a particular delivery system, right? So a combination of any of these things become a drug device combination product. And again, I think with the work in the presentation that's been made from a European EMA standpoint, with their 2019 document, they've also clarified the term combination product. And again, I think we're very consistent in what that means, generally speaking, across the globe. So the uniqueness that brings, and again, alluding back to the earlier presentation, right, is you're really taking two different development processes. One that drug R&D, which is, certainly where many of our pharma customers have their expertise and where they've been working and living for a lot of years. But now we're combining that with device R&D, which again has different sort of regulatory oversight and different development process. And so we'll touch on, through this presentation really, how should general recommendation on how this approach should be taken to try to make sure that we're meeting those requirements both from a drug and a device standpoint. So I think just some of the fundamental differences, right? On the drug side of things, you have scientists and drug formulators that are really focused on the drug product itself, right? What that ultimate dosage form is going to be. Looking at various side effects of the drug and certainly PK and other characteristics. The device developer is really an engineer, right? And so as you start to interact with your device experts, they're coming from a different area of expertise. And so ultimately, the goal here is to bring both those pieces together. Right, and ultimately the reason for that is because the focus is on product safety and product efficacy and patient safety, right? And so you really can't look at these things in a separate vacuum. And so that's really what all the regulations now are driving towards, right? Is this consideration of evaluating all of this together. Now, with that said, one of the challenges is basically just terminology is different, right? Terminology in the drug world is a little bit different than terminology in the device world. But the reality is the approaches as to device development and the approaches for drug development are very similar. And that's really, I think, what this slide is intended to show, is that bottom line, both whether it be device or drug, it's all formed from a quality system framework. There's a certain framework that's there that you need to follow. Your approach should be risk-based, and ultimately you should have a structured development process. So the actual thought process as you work through development of a combination product should be very similar, even though some of the terminology is different. As you see here, again, and there's a lot more supportive guidances and documentation out there than what you see here. But if you're familiar with quality by design drug development, that's really ICH Q8, Q9, and Q10. Right? That's what forms the basis for QBD. And so ultimately, you have that approach for the drug, but you also have similar ISO documentation and, again, quality system regs that have oversight from a device standpoint. So the thought processes should be very similar. So what are the challenges, and how, generally speaking, should this kind of process move forward? Again, it's really combining those various quality systems from both the drug and the device side of things. But one of the things that I also wanted to point out, and this is, again, I think a key understanding when you're talking about a combination product, and it is a little more from a device standpoint than maybe traditionally from a drug standpoint, and that is really understanding this material, component, and system fit. And the reason I bring that up is, of course, everybody's concerned from a drug standpoint with chemical incompatibilities and such that might occur with packaging. However, the material understanding in general is probably not as significant as it needs to be or has historically been in relationship to device development. And so if you actually look at again, the regs and the guidances, ultimately it should all start with understanding what materials you're using. Okay, qualifying those materials, understanding the component itself, and then ultimately how all the pieces, all the components fit together to form the system. And so just from sort of a mental framework, this is part of, if you start to build this understanding and start to build this story, this is part of what will form the foundation should you be asked the questions from the regulatory agencies, right? And of course, the other key piece here is just the coming together of the drug formulation itself with the package and the delivery device. And the whole point being looking at all this as it comes together and not necessarily always separately. So the first step in development goes back to defining what those targets are. What are you developing to? Starting with the end in mind, as they say. So really, what's your drug target product profile, and what are your user requirements, right? That's really where you need to start, because you need to make sure that as you're building the combination product, you're targeting those requirements. You need to evaluate options and understand the chemistry, right, of just how's the drug going to interact with whatever those materials are, whether it be from a chemical or a physical standpoint. So just some examples here. For instance, if you take a look at the syringe system that we have up top there, everything from understanding drug product viscosity, absorption, right? Is there the potential for some kind of interaction or absorption of the drug? Surface charges, right? They can have an impact. And you also are at the same time formulating for optimal delivery. And again, there's a variety of delivery devices out there now. And so you need to balance that with also the struggle to formulate some of these biologic products. So not only are there, 1 ml auto injectors, mil auto injectors, there's 2.25 out there now, syringe and auto injectors. They're wearable systems that allow more flexibility, maybe in the viscosity and the amount of what gets injected. So you really need to be as a drug formulator, you need to not only be thinking about the drug product and always, driving that ultimately down to what you may not be able to achieve in a 1 ml volume, but really consider that in conjunction with the delivery options that you have. Conformance with standards, okay? Historically, sometimes on the drug side, drug and packaging side, people would think, well, that's enough, right? I just need to meet standards. Ultimately, again, this goes back to proving that the drug product is meeting what its target product profile is, and conformance with standards is just an automatic that you need to tick off as a part of that. Okay, but you need to make sure that you have that information. I did certainly want to highlight for the group that as part of those standards, certainly I would think everybody's familiar with MDR, since we'll be going into effect shortly with that. But certainly there's the EMA document on quality requirements for drug and device combinations that came out in May is also, I think, it's a really nice document to be able to talk you through some of these considerations. And again, to me, conveys a lot of alignment. Certainly there's some differences because of, the notified bodies issues and things of that nature that you have in Europe that you don't necessarily have in the US. However, the logic, I would say, in the approach as to building your data in development should be very similar. I think the approach then as to how you need to work with the agencies that you need to work with and how you assemble your information is going to be different based on your regulatory region. However, I think the thought process here is if you build a robust combination product development process, you'll have the data and the information that you need for any of the regulatory agencies and regions you may go into. So another key piece here is effective risk assessment. And this is something that I really wanted to highlight because you will hear people talk about risk-based approach. What does that really mean? And ultimately, it's about driving to focus on the things that can have the greatest impact, right, to patient safety and drug effectiveness, right? And being able to prioritize what you're focused on, right? And ultimately, I think this is just one of the key areas because you need to do your risk assessments well. They need to be cross-functional, and that's critical in your approach to a risk assessment. And I've seen good ones and I've seen bad ones, right? And I think that's key because it really forms the foundation for knowledge management, which again, from a regulatory standpoint is being encouraged, more and more. And I think the other piece of this, and I don't know if, which I do highlight here too, is that these risk assessments are really living documents, as I call them. This is not a one-time deal and you're done, right? This is all about ongoing, updating, building knowledge, and leveraging that knowledge as you go forward. So just something that I think is just very key to a well-structured development program. Now, just quick example of, we talk about risks, understanding risks. We talk about, and we'll get here on the next slide, talking about critical quality attributes and things of that nature. But simple pre-filled syringe, right? Stake needle on the left, lure lock on the right side here. What are some of the things that you should understand and be able to have characterized around that product? Right, so this just gives you some examples from now a functional standpoint of things that you should be thinking about. And then really with focus on, and you may say, well, what are those sort of redheads, right? But those are some of the areas where there's really shared risk. And this is where looking at things not only separately as a component or a system, but that system with the drug product, there's identified sort of shared risks become very important. And so ultimately, those lead to understanding what the critical quality attributes of things like residual volume or delivered volume, plunger movement, things of that nature. So once you've identified critical quality attributes, you may start to hear, if you haven't already, the terminology of essential performance requirements, EPRs. Those essential performance requirements are identified as those key functional requirements that would be submitted. They would be submitted as part of the regulatory filing, but also something that you'd want to understand for sure over the shelf life of your product. So you need to understand how these things interplay, right? So only looking, for instance, at the end, at the auto-injector, you certainly need to understand that if this is a pre-filled syringe and an auto-injector. But what are the characteristics in the pre-filled syringe itself that can have an implication on those EPRs of an auto-injector? So, for instance, with the auto-injector, you're talking about delivered volume, needle length, maybe spring force or delivery time, or things that you need to understand from a critical quality attribute standpoint. What are things in that pre-filled syringe that can have an impact on that, right? So things like break loose and extrusion, right? Potential for biologic interaction with silicone. So again, we're trying to reinforce the connectivity of how all these pieces fit together. I think the other key piece in all of this, though, is not forgetting this is development is an iterative process, whether it be from a human factor standpoint, and I didn't want to lose sight of that, so that's why I'm trying to reinforce that here, and also in laying out and defining your testing program. As you're going through development of your combination product, you are learning things and you're feeding that back into your testing program, and that's what's building your knowledge base around the product. So again, ultimately, it's all about designing a product to protect and safely administer to the patient. And so just as some quick example, differences in things like spring force, needle gauge, needle length. Those are things that can have an impact on, for instance, the uptake of that injectable drug in the patient, and ultimately the dose and response relationship. So you can easily see the connectivity between the performance characteristics and the effectiveness in the end patient. And ultimately, right, with a combination product, you're working towards proving things through design verification and design validation. And I did want to take just a quick moment to reinforce the difference. Sort of say design verification is about building the thing right? So you've defined what your system is supposed to meet, your user requirements, the input and output, and you're proving through design verification that you've met those specifications. Design validation, however, is not an engineering process. It's actually a process where you're proving you built the right thing with consideration of the patient, and really looking at it from that system functionality as to how the patient now interacts with that product. So again, this terminology gets thrown around, and I just wanted to clarify that a bit. So to summarize on this slide a little bit, it's really a little bit different than just saying, okay, we're developing so that now we get this final information and put in the regulatory application. What you're doing during development is building evidence to support your decision making, and then that decision making builds into your knowledge base and also forms that connection to your control strategy. So that's another piece here that I didn't want to leave out, but ultimately that's certainly part of what the regulatory agency is going to be interested in. So what you're really doing is forming this foundation of knowledge for life cycle management going forward. As we talk about life cycle management, it ties to another recent document that's been released actually in November of this last year, and it's ICH-Q12. And I think this is really of interest. This is one I have been watching for a while, because I think, again, it really reinforces the fact that the expectation is not just launch a product, and that's really not the end, that's the beginning. And that's what's really trying to be reinforced through a document such as this. The focus here is on life cycle management of both drug product and combination products. So just to touch on it real quickly, because we don't have all that much time. It builds, though, from ICH, QA, Q9, and Q10. So again, as you start to see how all these documents connect, you can see how they start to really build from each other. So if you've already been working down that path of building increased product and process knowledge through the use of more of a QBD design process, you're on track for what needs to be done. Now, what ICH Q12 does, and again, I can't get into, I had to cut out some of the information I had here because of time, but they have highlighted just a set of what they're calling regulatory tools and enablers. So some guidance around post-approval CMC changes, talk about established conditions, post-approval change management protocols to help you through change, life cycle management documentation. Again, just I think reinforcing various aspects that you're probably already familiar with, but where they're saying these are all tools that can really help in management as you go through your product life cycle. The one I wanted to highlight was established conditions because, again, that might be a relatively new term to people. But ECs are legally binding information considered necessary to assure product quality. So in essence, these are things that you would highlight in your application as your established conditions for that, for instance, combination product. And what that does then is highlight for the regulatory agency, these are things that they expect if there's any impact to those established conditions, you will notify them of that, right? That they will be in the loop on that. Again, what we're highlighting here is that you as the marketing authorization holder clearly identify which are EC and which may just be supportive information. And that all has to do with the importance of those key pieces of information that you consider to be established conditions. So that includes not only test data and EPRs, for instance. EPRs would be typically considered established conditions. So if you've highlighted 3, 4, 5 EPRs, essential performance requirements, those would be established conditions that if there were any changes to those, that would go through, from a regulatory information standpoint. But there's also certainly aspects of the manufacturing process that may be considered established conditions. So, again, a lot of background on this. Did want to talk a little bit about ways that we've worked with customers to help work through these programs, because there's just a lot of experience in general as we've engaged with customers, whether it be around, certainly we see the combination products more and more, complex drug development. And I did want to highlight that for a minute because we're talking about here that even if there's certain, look at what the various modalities are that are in the drug product pipeline, it's changing, right? It's not just monoclonal antibodies anymore, right? So all those things, right, that complexity in your drug pipeline, we need to think about not only in conjunction with delivery, but also in conjunction with packaging, right? So, and again, in my mind, immediately where that goes, where that takes me to is back to materials and the understanding of the materials that you're using. And proving they're the right materials for that application. Navigating the requirements. We just touched on briefly here some of the changing requirements, right, that are ongoing. But every month almost, there's something new released that you need to stay on top of in relationship to packaging, delivery, combination products, and certainly just ongoing challenges with resource constraints. So one of the things that we have done is to work through a program where we've taken, one of the things that we've recognized was that We work and we have worked successfully with many customers, helping them through various issues. We work globally with all size customers, and we wanted to be more proactive in being able to say, how can we work with you and offer our experience and our knowledge to you to help mitigate your risks. And so that's really what the Simplify the Journey program is for us. Again, every customer may have different needs, but really what I want to highlight here is the capability to start a program early so that you start to build the data and the knowledge that allows you to answer the questions when they're asked by the regulatory agencies as the foundation for what you're doing. So just a quick example, early in your development, you may be evaluating different primary packaging and delivery systems, right? How do you go about doing those kind of screenings and that kind of basic work? I mean, one of the things that we've done early on to try to help fill gaps here is to actually put in small volume equipment in our laboratory to do not for human use filling for customers, right? Where you may need a few hundred samples for engineering studies or for work that testing that we could do for you. And that's really been a gap that we've seen because it is important, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, it's important that these packages and these delivery systems be assembled properly, right? Because that's going to have an impact not only maybe on chemical compatibility in some instances, but for performance and functional, right? How that plunger gets placed in that syringe is important. Okay, so to have the right kind of equipment to be able to do that is important. Phase 1 and Phase 2. What are the logical baseline data now that you may have chosen a certain package or delivery system that needs to be built, right? So even things like, extractables and simulation studies. But also at the same point in time, as you get into Phase 2, you really need to be thinking about your leachables method development validation, right? Because that work needs to be done so that by the time you get into your Phase 3, you're starting to generate data on your stability over shelf life, right? Because that's the expectation of the regulatory agencies to understand your leachables throughout your shelf life. Same with things like CCI, right? Container closure integrity testing, right? So again, just some quick examples. And then ultimately, to make sure you have your data generated for your Phase 3. And again, a lot of capabilities at West. I don't need to go into all those details, but everything from contract manufacturing support if that's needed and regulatory support. And then ultimately, lifecycle management. So again, just talking about the capabilities that you may need, even if products have been developed or methods have been developed and they need to be transferred. So one of the other key points to make here is when we talk about testing, I think it's important to understand that there's lots of labs that can say that they do certain testing. How well do they really understand the testing? And how well, is it just generating data, or is it understanding it in the context of whatever that characteristic happens to be? A perfect example, extractables and leachables testing, right? Something that when you're working with a company whose life is pharmaceuticals and biologics and supporting our customers in those areas, we have people that were part of the development of those chapters. Our team actually developed the ICH Q3D analytical method that is now in the USP for elemental impurities. 1207, understanding that there's more than one test method you need to have, okay, to be able to really answer all the questions that may be necessary depending on the type of product and the format and things of that nature. Performance and functionality, working with ISO to understand where they're heading and understand the connectivity to performance. And particle analysis. Another perfect example, it's not only particle analysis in the drug product that you're certainly familiar with, but particle analysis of your packaging components or your delivery systems. And testing those products is very different than testing drug product. So again, just need to be aware of these types of things. A couple comments, just to some examples that I wanted to show you of just things that practical examples that we've seen. Right, one of the things that has changed coming out of USP 1207 for CCI is this need to have validated methods on the specific package system. And again, just some of the examples of some of the questions that our customers have received and where we've helped them through these issues. Right, again, these couple happen to be around CCI. But one of the things that we like to do is work with the industry early so that you don't get these questions, right? We can advise on how this work could be done. And in the end, it's your call, but it's a way for us to try to mitigate some of the potential issues that you could have. So a couple other case studies that I just want to give you briefly here. A case where it was a small emerging biotech company, again, trying to build their information base, and the only capability they had was some particle testing. I mean, what we're able to do is to help fill in some of those gaps of capabilities that they really didn't have. A company qualifying a device. They may not, or their supplier who's ever supplying them the device may not have had a robust technical package around that. So understanding things like temperature and humidity and impacts of that. Customer that submitted a ANDA on a prefilled syringe system without basic BLE data. Right, again, being able to jump in and do that. And then the last example here is around PFS troubleshooting functionality, where customers, industry actually have done work to show that excipients could have an impact on the function of a syringe system. We've actually worked with them to show what a program where we're able to characterize and understand which excipients could have an impact on syringe and cartridge functionality. So again, I think with some background on combination product development, but also how we're able to fill in some of the gaps if you have them. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Fran, for this really huge overview about all the regulatory requirements and what it is more for drug development and combination product development. It was really, really appreciated. Thank you very much. Do there are any questions related to this topic? I have one question to you, because we see that pharmaceutical development is regulated in the ICH guidelines, and on the other hand, there is a engineering part for devices and combination products, and we have to keep in mind that there is an interaction between drug product development and the environment I mentioned this morning, and the combination product, and how we deal to combine the risk assessments to have a proper control strategy too. What could be a potential option to bring them together, the different understanding of CQAs and all these things?
Well, and I think that's a great point, and that's why ultimately when I stopped to focus a bit on risk assessments and FMEA, because when I talk about cross-functional team, really you need, through your development process, right, you'll go through various risk assessments. So you'll do work really in relationship to the drug, you'll do work in relationship to the device, but ultimately you need to bring together the right cross-functional team with knowledge to talk about all of it together. And so if all the work is being done only from a device standpoint and only from a drug standpoint, that's where the real challenge comes into play. Ultimately, you have to bring together some of those teams of people to be able to do the risk assessment, the cross-functional risk assessment properly, because you do need to consider these things. I think a perfect example is the example towards the end there that I gave on actually various drug excipient packages having the potential effect on break loose and extrusion of the function of a syringe system, right? And if you are doing that work and you don't have the knowledge that that could be a potential risk, and then how do you want to mitigate that? So how, of course, we're seeing some customers do that is we're actually helping them with some of that testing, right, to mitigate. They're actually providing various combinations of their excipient packages, and we're doing the work to prove which ones, would be best from a functional standpoint. So that's a way to mitigate that risk while you're in development. But if you didn't understand that your combination of excipient packages could have an impact on the function of your syringe system, and in essence, the function of your auto-injector then you wouldn't know that as and it wouldn't be an input into your risk assessment. So it's, it's complex, but people need to people need to think across different functions and areas of expertise. So it really is about broader thinking, I would say, and again, certainly deep knowledge in certain areas.
Okay, thank you very much for your interesting talk.